Hello, I'm Susan Averbach, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. What do we think about when we hear the word feminism? Today we'll be having a roundtable discussion about feminism from a middle way perspective. First, I'd like to introduce our guests, Shana Averbach and Tim Kaine. Shana Averbach is a San Francisco-based psychotherapist in private practice who's passionate about uncovering people's inner wisdom and strengths, greeting their critical voices with a warm skepticism, and helping them be kinder to themselves in general. A self-proclaimed feminist at the age of 9, she once wrote to Mattel, a toy company, enraged by a sexist commercial. Though her letter-writing advocacy has waned, she's in an ongoing dialogue about sex and gender norms, expectations, and inequalities in both her personal and professional lives. Welcome, Shana.
Thank you.
Tim Kaine is a software engineer, writer, and musician. He's interested in the way language, stories, and conceptual models influence the way we perceive the world. He's been experimenting with reversing gender roles in both fiction and professional documentation to see if anybody notices. Thank you for being here, Tim. I'm Susan Averbach. I'm a humanistic rabbi ordained by the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, and I'm a member of the Middle Way Society. I work towards developing a form of Judaism that comfortably fits with the Middle Way philosophy. Again, welcome everybody. We're going to have a fairly informal discussion today about feminism, what we understand feminism to be, the challenges it faces, where it's going, and how feminism relates to the Middle Way. Let's start with you, Shana. What's your understanding of what feminism is?
Well, my base understanding is feminism in its most simple form, which is that women should be treated equally with men in every domain of life. That was always my understanding growing up, which started with more of a, girls can do anything, boys can do it. Now that I'm older, I understand that having a well-rounded political equal pay, all that stuff. But now I add to it race equality, all these things that I think has sort of crept into modern times of kind of looking at equality for everybody, which so now I kind of hold it in that category, which then makes it feel overwhelming, which maybe we'll get into in some way. But in its most simple form, it's that women and men should be treated equally in all the important domains.
Tim, how do you think, what is your understanding of feminism?
I think what I'd say is pretty similar. It's about equality and being the same opportunities, and sort of trying to address some of the historical imbalances that we see between men and women, and kind of break down some of the gender roles.
I would love to hear some of your experiments with reversing the gender roles in your fiction. Do you have anything handy nearby, or?
Well, I tend to write quite long stuff, so I could describe a couple rather than
that would be great.
To read them. Well, one of the recent ones I did, it was taking a typical fairy story, kind of story like Rapunzel, and transposing that into a modern context, but having the man being the one who's trapped in the tower, and turning all the other characters more or less into women. Rather than having the prince, you have the warlord who is female, and you have the protagonist who's female, and it changes the way the stories feel quite often to the point where you don't recognise the same archetypes.
That's fascinating. That sounds really interesting. It really shakes people up the way we think. We don't realize how driven we are by the stereotypes. We talk about women's equality But then if you see a story where everything's reversed, I think would become more aware of how underneath it all we have the stereotypes in our own subconscious. So
I think it's important to try and bring up the
totally. Just hearing that description made me feel uncomfortable.
yeah. In a way, I think it brings us to, I mean, the middle way, the ideas of the middle way, that we need to be aware of our thinking and aware that we tend to make assumptions based on just how we're brought up. If you're brought up to think that a woman should obey her husband, which people in my generation, many of whom were brought up that way, and even if you're a feminist or you think you are, there can be underlying forces that make you not really accept that in your total consciousness. So seeing a story, sometimes fiction or art can make things more clear than just words of ideology. I mean, the definition of feminism that I got from the Oxford Dictionary is the advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of political, social, and economic equality to men. And it seems like that just scratches the surface in my mind. But maybe you can get deeper with fiction or film or some art form.
Yeah, I think there's some part of it is being able to show the roles that could be taken.
Mm-hmm.
I think a problem we have quite often is that when you look at the films, all of the exciting, interesting roles are taken by the men. Mm-hmm. And there are women in the films, but they're usually either a romantic target or some kind of victim. Mm-hmm. And I think to transpose these and make the women the characters without just making them these sort of stereotypical strong female protagonists, you know, like Lara Croft was a good example of someone whose only purpose was really to be a sex object, even though she was supposed to be the protagonist in these things. But to actually have real female characters with real nuance, taking up roles that can be sort of aspired to by people who watch and consume this media. So to have them being the hero, and to have them running the country, and to have them being the police officers and the store clerks and all these other little roles that always default to being male characters. If you take any random character in a film and say, right, we need a taxi driver, it's going to be a man. We need a doctor, it's going to be a man. You need more women in all these little tiny bit roles so we get the kind of visual that we can have that in our society. Because women make up over 50%, but they're only about 5% of the women on the screen.
Wow, is that true? 5%?
It's something like that. There's many films that don't have any women in, and if they do, they don't even have any speaking lines.
Wow. There is a new movie I saw yesterday. I think it's called The Martian, where women have very important roles. So it's getting a little better, perhaps.
Absolutely, it's certainly changing. It's certainly moving towards a more equal position, but it's being fought for. I don't think it's going to happen unless we take part in that.
I agree with you. I mean, I'm an age where I remember when feminism, the new wave of feminism from the late 60s, early 70s was just beginning. And I was involved in that. And people don't believe me when I tell them how the world has changed since then. You know, it was hard fought. My first job, I had just finished college, and the first task they gave me was to make coffee for the office because, you know, the women had to do that. And things have changed. It's not like that anymore in any offices I've worked in. So things have changed. But we fought very hard to, and it was even public television in San Francisco, public radio and television broadcasters made fun of the women's movement back in the early 70s. It was a joke. And I think it's not a joke anymore, obviously, which is very, very good.
Yeah.
Well, I think it kind of is. I think there's a pretty strong PR problem with feminism. I'm not sure that it might not be a joke, but I don't think it's terribly understood, especially among younger people.
Could you elaborate a little on that?
Yeah. Well, there's a whole, like, I don't need feminism movement and things of that nature that really emphasize I don't need feminism because I don't hate men. I don't need feminism because I'm not a victim. All these, I think to people who understand even the most simple form of feminism, it's a big what? What are you talking about? But I'm not sure that everything that was fought for or everything that didn't exist not that long ago, things like voting rights, things like your husband not owning you, things like being able to own property and that type of thing. I'm actually not sure that that people know that that was not only fought for, but pretty recently. I imagine the workplace stuff and being mistreated or not taken seriously and having to fetch coffee, things of that nature. I imagine that does still exist in the workplace. But for some reason that feels smaller when you have particularly young women walking around not knowing that some of the basic things they can do now they couldn't do that long ago. I mean, I think it's sort of in the same category as Holocaust deniers or slavery minimizers and things like that. Like, when we're not being taught what's happened in our recent history, we walk around taking pretty big things for granted. So I think there's, even what we're talking about with the movies and with characters and in talking about it, you can see little ways that it's getting better, but mostly I think people are walking around not being aware of those things, which is the problem, right? It's insidious. And I think it's a huge problem still in Hollywood, particularly for older women and who lose their sex appeal, on top of everything. And, then it's about not having strong characters, but it's also being keenly aware of how they're being objectified as they lose that quality. So I don't know. I think we're doing well in some basic ways, and there's a lot of work to do in other ways.
Even something as basic as equal pay.
Yeah, which is still not, like, that's a great example of something like I forget all the time. Every time I hear the statistics, like, I remember being very bothered by that, learning about that when I was little, and then I learned about that in college when I was in a women in the workplace class or something. And even just looking at the statistics now, every time I go, oh wait, what? 77 cents to the dollar, I think it is now, or maybe it used to be 75. And I'm sure I don't know the nuances of how that works, if it's what's behind that exactly, besides just basic word of inequality. But yeah, the equal pay is a great kind of tangible way to go, oh, you're doing the same thing and you're getting 3/4 of the pay.
It used to be 60%.
Yeah, so I guess that's a tangible way of seeing progress as well. Yeah.
One thing I heard recently, Meryl Streep was just asked if she was a feminist, and she said no, she's a humanist. And there was a big debate. It was something on Facebook, and it makes me think just the word feminism is problematic. There are people who really are feminists, but they don't want to say it because there's some sort of dogma associated with feminists. And I can think of dogma from the early 70s. There was a book that came out in the early 70s by Shulamith Firestone, where she advocated that babies be created starting in test tubes, that the only way to liberate women is to not give birth to babies. She was, the crazy side of feminism. I mean, she was very anti-male and anti kind of woman body instinct kind of way of being. And she came from a very dogmatic orthodox family, and I guess it was a reaction to that, but this was a popular book in the early 70s, and books like that gave feminism a bad name, I think, where men are considered the enemy, because I think men benefit from feminism very much as well, because men in the old days were very limited. Men couldn't show emotion, couldn't cry in public, couldn't show affection with other men. Heterosexual men in particular were judged for hugging a man. I think things have changed. Men can be more expressive because of the feminist movement. Would you agree with that, Tim?
Definitely, yes. I think the sort of joint benefits to both men and women of feminism is really important. And I'd also agree that I think there is an image problem with the word feminism. Like you mentioned, I think the sort of image of sort of what a feminist looks like. I don't know if you've seen the Bill Bailey with his T-shirt saying, "This is what a feminist looks like." That kind of impression of this man-hating, let's make men obsolete and get rid of them. I think there was a reference to that in Orange is the New Black, of some lesbian cult thing where they're all going to kill all the men off. And that kind of image, I think, does sort of underlie what a lot of people think of when they think of feminism. And because it's insidious now, because it's not so obvious on the surface, because you don't see women obviously being abused like properly in public, getting hit quite as much, it's sort of, you feel like it's kind of, a lot of people, I think, certainly in the West, certainly in the UK, I don't know how it is in America, but a lot of people seem to think that the fight's been won. I think there's a kind of complacency about it, that they feel like, I mean, I'm not just talking men, I'm talking women as well. A lot of women that I've talked to, I've got a couple of gay friends who, they reject sort of feminist ideas. We've had me and my wife have had a discussion with them about it. They wouldn't call themselves feminists, and they don't like the term. They feel alienated by it. And I think that's quite a challenge, because I think if you change the word, if you say humanist or something like that, it means something entirely different. But because it's got this history on the word feminism, a lot of people are trying to sort of distance themselves from that a little bit, even though actually their beliefs in general would align with that if they realised how deep the problem went. I think someone once said that if you want to annoy someone forever, teach them to spot bad kerning, which is where fonts on signs, the lettering on signs is done badly, and the word orders are wrong, and the letters are wrongly spaced. And I think that the point of that is similar to the point of feminism, in that if you teach someone to observe sexist behaviour, if you teach them to see when something is unfair or sex-oriented in that way, you see it everywhere. Everywhere you look, you will see some instance where things should be better, whether it's in the movies or in stories, or whether it's in the pay difference, or whether it's in just the way people are treated on the street, whether people are wolf whistling, whether you're allowed to wear the right clothes, whether you can dress how you want to wear. It's throughout everything in society, even down to the very core of our language, there is this gender bias. Right the way through. In every sort of professional documentation I look at, I work as a software engineer, so I look at a lot of technical documentation. And whenever a user of a system, so a web user or someone who's logging into this system, whenever they're talked about, they're always men. The user is a man, and there's a picture of a man. This is a human. It's a person, but it's always a man. And that kind of cuts through. I mean, it's thousands of years of our language has been based on a male-dominated culture, and it's English as a language particularly is weighted very heavily towards the male. And I think that's something that's going to take a long time to sort of break down. And I think a lot of the extreme arguments in history have come across, from feminism, have come across where they've tried to break down these languages dramatically. They've tried to attack head on whenever language is male bias. And I think that's quite difficult. But language is changing. in this country, we used to have what was called a WPC, which is a woman police officer. So we had a police officer and a woman police officer. And now that's no longer the case. We now just have a police officer. And we used to have a fireman, but now we have a firefighter.
Mm-hmm.
So these things are changing, but they don't change because someone gets really angry about it and refuses to use the word manhole and insists on calling it a maintenance cover. There are a lot of words that have man in, and sometimes people take that too far. I heard someone arguing that the word craftsmanship should be changed because it has the word man in it.
Yeah, it's
and
like
I think,
like history, herstory.
Yeah, exactly. But you get to these problems with language that because man refers to our whole species,
Mm-hmm.
when they say, mankind, they don't mean just the males.
Mm-hmm.
They mean everybody. But the language is tilted that way because males have been in dominance.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a woman doing a role that was done by a man before, they'll change the word. So you don't have an actor, you have an actress.
Mm-hmm.
And that's explicitly diminutive.
Yeah, I never use the word actress anymore. I call them all actors.
Absolutely, and so do I. And I think that happens a lot now. That is changing. But we still have princess, and we still have any number of other ones,
Mm-hmm.
which are the same thing, where they've tacked on an extra bit to say, not really. Like, you're not a prince, you're a princess, sort
Mm-hmm.
of a princette. A little, it's a smallening of the word, which
Mm-hmm.
takes away some of its authority. It will change, and in my stories I do that. I will always use the male, or not the male, but the formal version of the words. So I'm quite happy to call a female character a prince.
That's
because
interesting.
I think that helps break down some of these. I mean, these words were designed to alienate women, to separate women. They put these in specifically. People have did this deliberately. It's not like it just evolved that way by accident. Men have made these distinctions.
What happens is cultures just perpetuate themselves within the family. It's like religion. I mean, when I was thinking about the discussion we'd have today, I thought about the middle way and religion. And people just tend to continue whatever they're brought up. I mean, their point of view about the world becomes perpetuated just in the family, being in a family where there are certain beliefs. And then as people grow up, they might question and move on and maybe join the middle way society. But the same goes for the role of women. How do you think about, are you a member of the middle way society, Tim?
I am, yes.
Yes. How do you think about, how do you relate feminism to the middle way?
I'm not really sure. It's a sort of, I think it comes down to just taking a kind of middle way approach to it, if you know what I mean. But I do that to just sort of generally. But it's a case of, it's sort of shying away from the extremes, really. I think to recognise there is an issue is one thing, and then to act in a way that promotes the view of the world that you want, without going out and aggressively forcing your opinion on other people. I think I can't remember who said it, but be the change you want to see in the world is one of the quotes I quite like. So if you behave as if you believe there is equality or there should be equality and call out places where there is inequality without doing it in an aggressive way, I think that's more or less a middle way approach to it. So rather than getting to the extremes of denouncing men or anything at one end, or ignoring the problem and saying everything's fine at the other, there's some kind of middle place where you can say, I recognise there is a problem and I'm going to do my part, but without trying to alienate other people, or without trying to, I suppose it's being mindful about the situation. It's about not harming while you're doing good.
That makes a lot of sense to me, thinking about the extremes of, men are superior, and then the early feminists in the early 70s, women are superior, and then the middle way is just recognizing that that we have to work on our relationships with each other, and nobody's superior. Those extreme views are just that, they're absolutes, which is why the kind of feminism I would want to see is a middle way, just as you're describing, Tim. How about you, Shana? How do you see it as middle way?
Yeah, sort of in a similar vein, like Tim is saying, sort of embodying this sense of equality. And, I think of sort of the definition of assertiveness within there too as a middle way. If we're walking around living our beliefs, asserting our beliefs about equality, speaking up about things in a way that actually allows us to be heard, not being aggressive and squashing anybody along the way, not being passive or permissive and pretending nothing's happening, like Tim mentioned, but asserting in both our words and our actions and listening to each other, right? Mm-hmm. And finding opportunities to pass along the message that we're all valuable. And it really does, honestly, the term humanist keeps popping into my mind with this too. And, my understanding of the middle way is a really strong belief that dogma isn't the way to go, and that, in its most basic form, it's if you've been taught that men are superior or one race or class is superior, to not accept that as your truth and to find examples in your daily life of not that, or at least question what you've been told and what you see, even in subtle ways.
That's great. It's really thinking about what's happening and being mindful of how we are with each other. It is beyond male and female. It is about race. One thing that occurred to me.
Absolutely is. Yeah, and I think about, the assertiveness piece all the time. I mean, it comes up in my practice all the time with women and with men. A lot of people are walking around with a deep discomfort of just speaking up for their basic needs, not wanting to seem too needy, not wanting to seem too heavy-handed. And again, men and women, men too have been conditioned, it's just two different things. I think it's women, there's just no perfect way to do it, right? Like, you don't want to be too pushy, you don't want to be too needy. And with men, maybe sometimes they've been taught just due to their upbringing that there is a more gentle way, but it doesn't fit with their work culture. It doesn't fit with the other men around them to not be aggressive in certain ways. And then they're stuck too. I don't know. I think we all get caught up and all feel stuck no matter what category of life we belong to. It's very connecting. It's very human. Mm-hmm. But if we don't question the backdrop, sometimes just looking at the backdrop of where you're taking these messages from can be really helpful in questioning that. But the human piece, and I think that's, how I was brought up is, we're all connected. Just that very basic understanding, I think, is very helpful in feeling like you have a network of human beings behind you if you're willing to question certain norms and let yourself be uncomfortable and let yourself stand up for things even if your voice is a little shaky or whatever. To be courageous in your daily life, to question what you've been taught. Sounds like the middle way is that. It's harder to do, frankly. It's much harder. Much easier to fall in line sometimes, but it doesn't really serve us at our core. It doesn't always serve to connect either.
And it doesn't change society. If everyone would accept the way things were in 1968, for women, would be in a very different place. Although I will say, I have a friend who was in graduate school at that time, and her theory was that the reason that women got more rights was because the society needed women, more middle-class women in the workforce than they needed after World War II.
Yeah.
The economy needed them, and therefore the feminist movement just naturally was reinforced by that economic need of society. So it wasn't just because UC Berkeley were out there, fighting for karate for women or anything like that. It was because the economy needed women in the workforce. But I wonder if probably the same thing was happening in the UK, Tim. Do you think?
Yeah, I think there's probably a bit of both here as well. It's because I think after the wars, well, both, I don't know which one they were, the First World War and the Second World War, a lot of women ended up working during the war in the factories here.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously when the men came back from the front and wanted their jobs back and wanted to be, back in the position they were in before, it was a lot harder to tell the women they couldn't do these things because they had been doing them. Mm-hmm. Certainly, if all the munitions factories, I think they're all women doing all the work, and they used to fly planes, and they used to drive the trucks and the buses and everything. So I think they used to take the pilots out, and they did on machine gun practice and things. So they used to fly the prop planes to use as target practice, tracking the targets behind and things like that. So they were very involved.
Yeah.
And then when things calmed down and there was a lot of rebuilding to be done, it was very hard to say, well, that's, but thanks for the help, but we don't need you anymore, sort of thing. So I think they had a bit of a platform to stand on at that point.
That's what happened here as well. The women worked, Rosie the Riveter, she was called. The women were very involved in war industry. And then when the men came home, women were encouraged to stay home. And there was this whole cult of homemaking, and many women who had been in the workforce were forced out. So there was a period of about probably 20 years where middle-class women, and that is one of the critiques of feminism in the U.S., is it's a middle-class movement. Middle-class women became more and more disaffected, and the book Feminine Mystique came out. Betty Friedan, who wrote about how awful it felt to be in that position of homemaker and not be able to work, or, she wrote against that culture of being squelched. And that was the beginning of the modern feminist movement in the U.S. That brings to mind something else. We're mostly talking about modern Western societies. If we look at the entire world, women are in a very bad position in most parts of the world. Feminism hasn't even begun to have an effect for many women in other countries that are third world.
Yeah, well, and that again brings the word, right, as you're saying that, like the term human rights comes up.
Right.
Right, just basic human rights, because when you think about what is going on for women in many third world countries, dehumanized is the term that comes to my mind. Same with major class differences in third world countries too, where truly some people are living like kings and queens, and some people are really at the bottom of the barrel and don't seem to have their human rights considered. And it's a huge difference in Western civilization versus other places.
One thing we haven't talked about is what it's like for women in the workplace and women and men when they have children at home. If there's a difference for women and for men when, let's say, the kids are sick or they need to go to the doctor or any of the... have you noticed a difference, Tim, in where you are about how it is for women and for men in the workforce?
Yes, I think it is different. I mean, we have different amounts of leave available to men and women when a child is born by law here. I think as a man you're allowed 2 weeks, whereas a woman you're allowed to take up to a year and still go back to your job.
Wow.
Obviously that year isn't paid, but it's kind of that's the statutory sort of the line in the sand, as it were. And I think there are changes though, because when I've got a daughter and she's 1 year old tomorrow, so we've just sort of gone through that year, and I had about 9 months where I only worked 2 days a week. So my boss said, that's fine, I can take sort of partial leave, as it were, for that time. And Kat, who's my wife, and she runs her own business. She runs a business from home. So she took up the slack, and we've basically taken it half and half between us. So we're both fully involved. So I think that's how I think it could be and should be. I think we could do more legally to sort of redress that balance. I think if men and women were both able to take 6 months or a year off, it would certainly change the pay differential. So I think quite often when a man is hiring, male manager is hiring, and he can choose a man or a woman of the age where they might be having children, even if they don't explicitly think about it, they have to consider the fact that if the woman goes off for 9 months or a year, maybe up to 3 times in the next 10 years, that's a lot of lost productivity. Mm-hmm. And he can be pretty sure the man isn't going to do that. Even if the man chooses to have children, he will still come to work. Mm-hmm. So I think that underlying inequality there, mm-hmm. big driver of the pay difference between men and women.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. What do you think about this issue, Shana?
Yeah, well, I'm obviously, I'm in the thick of it too, Tim. Our son just turned 1 as well. And yeah, in terms of the workforce issue and taking time off, I think what would be helpful would be if people leaned into a little bit more of a flexible view of work, as in it not needing to be the 40-hour work week, not needing to be on site all the time. I think that would do a lot for women and men and, people in general in terms of that issue, in terms of maternity leave and whatnot. I feel conflicted about your original question of, taking time off work, baby being sick, things of that nature. We also have a pretty fair balance in our household. I work part-time. I have my own business. I've had the choice. I have a master's degree. I'm in a position and privileged in numerous ways due to my education, due to living here, to have been able to create that for myself and being a mom. Not that it doesn't feel impossible some days just to do the amount that I'm doing, but I also have a husband who is extremely hands-on, who does work full-time, but does have flexibility in terms of going into the office at times. But yeah, it's hard. I'm having a hard time thinking outside of my individual view because, my son was just sick and I'm still nursing. And of course, I want to be with him because it's more comforting to him to as he was fairly ill, to be able to be with him. That said, I have a husband who, if he had to be the person to do that, if I wasn't able to, he would. So really privileged in that respect. But what would it be like if that was the norm and not the exception? I think in the Bay Area, which another bias that is important to name, that, talking to you from San Francisco, California, where there's a lot of stay-at-home dads, and there's a lot of people who actually know a lot of people just in my social circle where the moms are the primary breadwinner and they're working full-time and the dads are home. So they are doing more of that split in the less than conventional way, and people are making it work in every way. So on a more systemic level, again, I think looking at flexibility, looking at why we value coming into the office, for at least a 40-hour work week, more than allowing for flexibility, looking at actual productivity levels, which my understanding is that they are not higher the more you're in the office. I think they've looked at it. And again, so here we're speaking the dogma. For some reason, we've been taught that there's one way to work full time and there's one way to be a valuable worker. And I think if we were to kind of pan out and all gender, sex differences aside, look at what works instead of what we believe works, that would be really helpful to speak to this issue of maternity, paternity leave, not to mention just well-being in the workplace, right? Overall, it's not just a parenting issue; it's a well-being issue.
Very middle way to
Yeah.
the way you're describing it. It's not what you believe; it's what works. It's
sure.
what you experience, and it's provisional, and you try different.
Yeah, I think we could actually be pretty pragmatic with how we look at work, but you can see how this like feeds into even capitalism and just consumerism and things like that. It's like work, and then feel like you need stuff, and then buy a bunch of stuff to feel better because you're so worn out and all. This is when I think I started within one sentence saying when I start thinking about this stuff, I get very overwhelmed because it ends up very big, and that's just another way, right? Like. That I think it just grows into, you have to stop, pause. I think Tim used the word mindfulness earlier, and look at what is happening, and then allow a little bit of space for that. Yeah, that more middle way of like, okay, what can happen? What is possible to happen so that we're living in a way that we're standing on this ground and being present with each other and have some space to connect and space to figure out what's even important to us.
Tim, are there any final words you'd like to say?
I'm not sure. I think it's a very big subject, and there's a lot of things that could be said about it. But I'm not sure. I know I have a point on top of my tongue at the moment. No.
Well, I'd like to just close with saying that your daughter, Tim, and your son, Shana, are going to, what I would hope is that when they're your age, maybe they'll be on a podcast and it'll be a completely different situation. They won't even be, it'll be something from history about when men and women were not considered equal. I mean, the time off will be the same, after people have a baby. It will have progressed tremendously from where it is now, just as it has progressed tremendously from when I was your age, being a generation older than both of you. So that would be my hope. And I'm pretty optimistic that will be true. Anyway, we can only hope, because they have great role models. Your 1-year-olds have great role models. So thank you so much for the discussion. And
thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it.
You can find out more about middle way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.